I'm so excited to welcome Jessie Carmen to speak to us tonight about this very, very important topic of how do we prevent, how do we identify, and how do we help with eating disorders in our kids. Jessie comes to us, oh, I can't minimize. So Jessie is a licensed clinical social worker with multiple years of experience with Renfrew centers in Boston and in Los Angeles. Renfrew is a nationally recognized leader in eating disorder treatment. Jessie consults to lots of schools and parent groups about these exact topics. She's a wonderful speaker. I think kids really connect to her, so I'm just really excited to have her here. We are going to take questions at the end via the chat, so you can put the questions in whenever you want, but at the end we have plenty of time that we will go through them and answer them. Everybody is muted when you're coming in, so to avoid, mistakes and things like that. So welcome very much. Welcome, Jessie. Take it away.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen just so that everyone can see my screen and follow along with what I'm saying. So it's so great to see all of you on Zoom. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm so glad that we're talking about this topic, one that I'm extremely passionate about. So there's a few things that I'm going to touch upon throughout the hour, and the main concept or the main thing that I'll be discussing is eating disorder prevention. So I'll go over how the language that we use can really affect the kids and our children around us, the signs and symptoms of eating disorders, and when to worry about your children and how to get them help. So we'll be touching about a lot, and I know that Marissa said that we are going to take questions at the end, but there might be something that comes up as I'm speaking. Just write it in the chat and I'll get to it at the end. Absolutely. So here we go. All right. So first, who am I? So I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm originally from Boston, Mass. I moved to Los Angeles 2 years ago. I teach human development and I'm an advisor at Campbell Hall. I am an eating disorder consultant, coach, and therapist, and my experience in eating disorders comes from the Renfrew Center for Eating Disorders, which is all across the nation, and I used to work in Boston and Los Angeles at the Eating Disorder Treatment Center before going off on my own. Oop. One sec, I'm so sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay, so a few things to consider and remember before I get started. I always like to start the presentations with this because first off, every single human has a relationship with food in their body, right? I have a relationship with food in my body. You all have a relationship with food in your bodies. Every single person has a relationship with food in their body, regardless of what it is, right? It can be great, it can be terrible, it can be something in between, but every single person has a relationship with it. And these relationships go back as early as childhood. And because of that, they're incredibly personal. These are personal relationships. And because of that, sometimes things around food and body can feel very attacking. And so I always like to start my presentation by saying that this is not about being right. This is not about being wrong. This is all about prevention. This is what we know helps to prevent eating disorders in kids. You do not have to agree with me. You do not have to agree with what I'm saying. And we know that this is what prevents kids from having eating disorders. And then also eating disorders don't discriminate. So that means they don't discriminate across body type. They don't discriminate across gender, race, sexual orientation, gender expression, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. We'll get a little bit more into that, but they don't discriminate for anyone. So thoughts about food and bodies start as early as kindergarten. So this is a presentation for just about anyone, regardless of how old your child is. The National Eating Disorder Association came out with this, quote that says, by age 6, girls especially, so boys as well, and, those that don't identify as boy or girl, start to express concerns about their own weight or shape. 40 to 60% of elementary school girls ages 6 through 12 are concerned about their weight or about becoming too fat. This concern endures throughout life. So unfortunately, what we see is that when a girl who's 6, 5, 6, 7 years old, and we do see this happens all the time, when they're having concerns about food, weight, their bodies at 6, unfortunately, if it's not nipped in the bud, or it's not kind of seen and really talked about, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. So it's just a really important topic to talk about, and also just be mindful of and observant of, regardless of how old your child is. So what can we do, and where is our locus of control, right? Like, what can we, if we know this, there are certain things that we can do. And it all starts with our language. Language is so important when it comes to food and body. You know, as a society, we sometimes can equate our morality with the food that we eat. So one of my least favorite phrases is "you are what you eat." Don't like it. And the reason for that is because you know, it really correlates our morality with, you know, who we are as people, and then our kids can hear that and listen to it, and they are sponges, right? So then they kind of learn that, okay, so if someone says, "Oh my God, I've been so good today," right? Usually when someone says that, it's not about being kind or helpful or moral or opening the door for someone. It's about eating a salad, right? And if someone says, "I've been so bad today," usually it's not that they've committed a crime or they've robbed someone, but rather that, you know, maybe they ate too many cookies than they wanted to. So really, really thinking about, you know, how do we equate our morality with what we eat and the food that we eat, and being conscious of that. There are ways that we can work to get away from that. So the first one is trying not to talk about food in a binary. So we're conditioned as humans in a diet culture and diet-centric world to think of good foods as good and bad. So what I'm preaching, what I'm saying is to stop thinking of foods as good and bad and just think of things as food, just food, right? I'm not trying to say that like all food has the same nutrition in it, because of course it doesn't, right? So, you know, I think one of the phrases that I really like to use is nutritionally dense. Like there's gonna be foods that are more nutritionally dense than others. For instance, kale is more nutritionally dense than Oreos, but recognizing that our bodies know what to do with both. And so an alternative to healthy or unhealthy food, or good and bad, could be like eating the rainbow or eating all the colors, and also remembering that, you know, white is a color. So like not saying that any of the colors are bad, but really saying like, okay, yeah, like let's eat the rainbow. Let's eat all the colors. Another word that is treats, and the word treat can take on a lot of power. So, you know, again, it's kind of taking the power away from certain foods, not making that food as powerful, and really seeing all food as treats, because genuinely it is, right? Like, you know, you eat a piece of fruit, that's a treat. You eat a cookie, it's a treat. You eat a salad, it's a treat. Like, you know, it is a treat that we get to eat all of these foods. And so like just bringing that into your vocabulary can be a really good thing to do for kids and teens and, you know, whomever. And then also this one is really essential, and it's being really careful about commenting on people's bodies in front of your children, your body, their body, other people's bodies, just like no body comments. And instead of talking about the aesthetic of someone's body or the aesthetic of your kids' bodies, really talking about the functionality, right? So the example I give is, you know, your legs, right? So instead of saying something like, "Your legs look so great," you know, really being able to say like, "Oh my gosh, like your legs like allowed you to climb up this mountain," right? Or they allow you to run, right? And so really getting into like the functionality piece of the body rather than the look of the body. Sorry, okay. Just quickly, I wanted to tell you all about Nicole Cruz. She's a dietitian She's on Instagram at Nicole Cruz RD, and her website is above at NicoleCruzRD.com. And she's a wonderful resource for, kind of navigating this, the world that we live in, which is very diet centric, while also preventing eating disorders in kids. So, one of the questions that I get all the time or in these presentations is like, okay, so are you saying I should just like let my kid eat as much sugar as they want? And she does a really good job at like framing this and reframing it, and the language, and just really pressing on the fact that the language that we use is so important. So like, for instance, here, she's saying teaching children to be scared of sugar leads to sneaking sweets, disordered eating, feelings of guilt and shame. What it does not do is help them better regulate sweets, right? So just kind of remembering those things and giving you ways to talk to your kids about them. All right, so switching gears a little bit to eating disorders specifically. When I'm talking about the eating disorders, a lot of what I'm talking about is the experience that I have working at the eating disorder clinic. So, it's less of like what you would look at in a textbook or online, and more on, based on my experience, what we see between all the different eating disorders. So the first thing that I want to say before we even get into the specific eating disorders is that eating disorders are not about food. They are coping mechanisms. So it's not about the food. It's not about, sometimes, eating disorders can get a bad rap, and people can say that it's just about how someone wants to look. It's not about how someone wants to look. It's not about food. It's not about eating. They're coping mechanisms for something larger going on. And to be honest, they're pretty good coping mechanisms until they're not. So, they're really helping to cover up depression, anxiety, OCD, trauma. These are things that we see comorbidly happening with eating disorders. So when do we know when eating disorder is developing? This is a tough one. It can be really tough because, especially too, and when I'm teaching my students and I'm talking to the parents at my school too, typically, it can be tough because teenagers' bodies are changing so rapidly. And so like naturally they're thinking about their bodies more. And so someone thinking about their body doesn't necessarily mean that they have an eating disorder. What we really see when someone has an eating disorder is the preoccupation with food, exercise, their body, and how that navigates their mood. So when I assess for eating disorders and I ask the question to the client, how much brain space do you think is being taken up by food and body image? Their answer is always 60% or more. And they're really, for them, like that's so their reality that it's like, wait, everyone doesn't think about this like 75, 80% of the time. So it's a really high number. There's not a lot of brain space for anything else. And then the other questions to consider are, one, how is this person's emotional and social life being affected? Are they not going to plans? Are they not going out to eat? Do they not want to see their friends anymore? How has their mood changed, especially before, during, or after a meal? Are you noticing a huge mood shift if you say that there's pasta for dinner? Or are you seeing that, after a meal, there's a huge mood change? That's definitely a red flag. And is this person basing many decisions off what they have eaten or going to eat? Is their day being dictated by food and typically exercise as well? So I'm going to break down the different eating disorder signs and symptoms. The first one we're going to talk about is anorexia. And generally, anorexia is marked by restriction of food. You will not only see this in food, you'll also see it in other parts of other parts of life. So there'll be restriction in social life, like not really seeing people as much. There'll be restriction in activities, or not doing the things really that they used to like to do. And the signs of symptoms include, but are certainly not limited to, skipping meals, oftentimes saying things like, I already ate, or I'm not hungry, especially during meal times, like where it kind of just doesn't add up. You've like never seen them really be eating, but they keep on saying that they have. Cutting food into really small pieces, especially food that you normally wouldn't cut. Eating extremely slowly. Weight changes. It does not have to always be a significant change in weight that is like low weight. People with anorexia can be typical weight, but still have anorexia. Dizziness, headaches, lightheadedness, out of breath, discoloration of skin, growing hair outside their body known as lanugo, constantly being cold, and significant mood changes, either really low mood, or there's also something called anorexia high, which is when your brain goes into this mode where it's kind of this like better than mode, where people think that, you know, their brain has trained them that they don't have to eat. And because of that, they are superior to others and kind of have this pseudo high or happiness feeling, especially when they're not eating and especially when they're extremely hungry. The other thing about anorexia that can be really scary is refeeding syndrome. This is why anorexia and the other eating disorders, and I'll get into this more, really require medical doctors to be overseeing them. Refeeding syndrome is a complication that happens with anorexia where your body starts to see food as a foreign object because you're not eating and you're not putting enough caloric intake into your body. And so because of that, when someone starts eating again, their body will reject the food and their organs will reject it. And it will kind of go into this mode of not knowing what's happening. And so that there can be fluid shifts and electrolyte shifts that can be really, really, really dangerous. So this is one of the many reasons why eating disorders just can't, it's very difficult to just like cure one on your own. Because it really is a medical disorder as well and needs to be overseen by a doctor. Next is bulimia nervosa. So bulimia is marked by purging, binging behaviors and then followed by purging behaviors. So the biggest thing to note about bulimia is getting rid of. So it's eating. So there's not as much restriction. They are eating, but they're getting rid of the food in various means, whether that is making themselves vomit, or over exercising, or laxative use, or diuretic use, which is water pills. They're getting rid of the food in some way. Signs and symptoms included, but not limited to, someone is eating a large amount of food and then immediately or routinely and secretly using the bathroom afterwards, experiencing dizzy and lightheadedness. Electrolyte imbalances will happen a lot with bulimia because of the vomiting, the frequent vomiting and diarrhea. Complains of throat hurting a lot and damages in the esophagus. Teeth and enamel decay. Dentists are actually usually one of the first people to recognize bulimia in a client. And exercising for hours at a time and significant mood changes if that doesn't happen. So kind of like dictating their whole day around exercise. And then weight changes, either decrease, increase. It depends on the person. But I think the biggest thing that I want to really press on with eating disorders is that A, it's certainly not always a weight decrease, and B, eating disorders affect every single type of person and every single type of body type. Binge eating disorder, that is the most common eating disorder actually. The signs and symptoms of binge eating disorder is eating a large quantity of food in an uncontrollable fashion. So kind of feeling unconscious while someone is doing it and not getting rid of that food. Binge eating should not be confused with overeating or emotional eating, which is what every person in society can do at times. So binge eating disorder or binge eating is certainly not the same as overeating or emotional eating. So the signs and symptoms of binge eating disorder, again, eating a large amount of food at a very fast rate. And people who like typically struggle with binge eating disorder might say things like, I felt like I was blacked out, or I felt like I had no control over what I was doing, or I didn't even want to eat, but I was doing it anyways, or I wasn't hungry at all, but I like couldn't control myself, or I couldn't stop, right? So like really this feeling that it's very unconscious. Significant feelings of shame or guilt. This is a huge one. So, you know, with overeating or emotional eating, you know, there's usually not that shame or guilt. Like if you know, maybe you're kind of full, but you're eating pizza and you really like the pizza, so you have another slice and you're just like, oh, okay, whatever, that was really good. With binge eating, there's usually an extreme sense of shame spiraling and guilt that follows. And then usually what will happen afterwards is a restriction. So a lot of people who have binge eating disorder also struggle with restriction because of the shame and guilt that happens with the binging, then follows the restriction the next day. And then because of restricting and starving themselves all day, then they end up binging later in the afternoon or night again, because their bodies are hungry, of course. I mean, it's just a natural thing that our bodies do. Weight changes, typically it's weight gain, but not necessarily so. And hiding food or not wanting to eat in front of other people. Other specified feeding and eating disorders, or OSFED. So this is just really an eating disorder that a lot of people are diagnosed with, because like a lot of other things, we don't usually fit into boxes. And, you know, eating disorders don't really fit into that as well. And so there are people who struggle with eating disorders who struggle with a bunch of different symptoms. And then usually they'll get a, you know, other specified feeding and eating disorder diagnosis. Orthorexia is an eating disorder that you might have heard before, or maybe you've never heard of it at all. It's actually not technically in the DSM-5, but it is an eating disorder that is very prevalent in our society. And it's an eating disorder that a lot of people are struggling with. And in the eating disorder world is one that is definitely diagnosed and talked about a lot. And orthorexia is really a preoccupation with clean eating, health, and wellness, to the point where it's like really, really, really affecting your daily life. So, you know, again, it's a hard line because we really do live in a very diet-centric world. And so it can be a difficult eating disorder to diagnose. But again, the thing that I really want to press on is the fact that it's really affecting someone's functionality and the way that they're living their life, right? They might be skipping out on plans because, you know, their friends are going to a certain restaurant and they have no idea what's in the food, or they feel like they can't eat anything on the menu because they haven't made it themselves. And therefore they don't know if the food is, quote, like clean or not. So it really affects their daily life. It affects their mood. It affects their social life. It affects their family life and their relationships. So it's something that's getting in the way of them being able to function fully in their everyday life. So avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID. ARFID is an eating disorder that is different than a lot of the other disorders that I just talked about, because ARFID typically has nothing to do with body image. So all of the other eating disorders have some body image component to it, whether that is, you know, having really low body image, low self-esteem. ARFID usually doesn't involve that. So with ARFID, it is a preoccupation with certain types of food. So it's definitely different than picky eating. But oftentimes, you know, that might be like the term that people are using is like picky eating, but it's to such an extreme that there are only certain foods that a person deems as safe and everything else they cannot eat. And it's so extremely distressing that they have an extreme emotional reaction to whatever it is that they're being asked to try or do. So a lot of people with ARFID will only stick to simple foods like bread, pasta, chicken nuggets, and it has nothing to do with the nutritional density. So it's like they're not the most nutritional dense foods at all, actually. Usually they're foods that are not nutritionally dense at all. So people with ARFID will sometimes struggle with malnourishment because of that, because they are only eating simple white foods like bread, pasta, and chicken nuggets. And so they aren't getting their nutrients. They're not getting their minerals. They're not getting their vitamins. Usually for people with ARFID, fruits and vegetables are off limit because of the texture. And so usually it's based on texture, taste, and look. And again, I put the note, if your child's a picky eater, this does not mean they have ARFID, because the greatest question really is to ask, like, what is the emotional experience they have when asked to try new foods? Like, what does that look like? How distressed are they? Are they able to just be like, okay, fine, I'll have one bite, and if they don't like it, they won't eat it? Or, you know, is a tantrum happening? Are they hysterical crying? Are they, you know, really not able to try it? So that's really the main question to ask in that situation. Marginalized populations in eating disorders. So again, and I said this in the beginning of the presentation, but eating disorders don't discriminate. There are many eating disorders affect all genders and all ethnicities and races and sexual orientations and socioeconomic status. It can be known as a white wealthy disorder. I think part of that is because eating disorders are very expensive to get treatment for. And so a lot of people who are getting the treatment are people who can afford the treatment. But despite that, there are similar rates of eating disorders with people of color as white people. It's just that sometimes, or oftentimes, people of color are less likely to get treatment than white people. According to NEDA, National Eating Disorders Association, Black teenagers are 50% more likely than white teenagers to exhibit bulimic behaviors. And eating disorders occur at alarmingly high rates in the LGBTQ plus communities, especially with transgender youth. Part of that is because of, you know, being in, you know, the body that doesn't feel normal or doesn't feel like their body, and wanting to manipulate that to make their body feel more like them. So that's one of the reasons why we see eating disorders a lot in trans youth. And then also in the gay male community, we'll see eating disorders often due to the value that is placed on aesthetics and the way that they look and diet culture and exercise culture in that community. Social media and eating disorders. So, you know, social media it's been, you know, at an alarmingly high rate, TikTok, Instagram, all of those things. And it's really affecting teens. It's affecting, you know, their body image and eating disorders. There's things on social media, you know, on TikTok, there's these trends that can be really toxic, of like what I eat in a day and like all these other things that, you know, people spewing information that aren't qualified to do so, aren't professional. And, you know, teens are taking that and running with it. So yeah, so this statistic, you know, it's a really alarming one, but in a study on social media, nearly all girls, 95%, say they see the onslaught of negative body critiques on social media posts, comments, photos, and videos, and a majority see them at least once a week and wish social media were a space that empowered body positivity. So I always, when I'm talking to students about this topic, I always really, tell them or share with them that it could be really a good idea for them to do like a social media detox. And like, I don't even mean get off of social media, because sometimes it's really unrealistic for teens. Like, I think one of the ways that they feel connected is through social media. So one of the things that I share with them is like, no, go on your social media and see who are the influences that make you feel good about yourself and who are the influences that make you feel bad about yourself. And all of those influences that make you feel bad about yourself, like unfriend them, like don't look at them. And like for everyone that you unfriended because it makes you feel bad about yourself, add someone that actually makes you feel good about yourself. So that's like that's just something that I do with my students and my clients, and when I'm talking to people, kind of encouraging them to do that. So again, you know, I just kind of went over this, but it can be dangerous. It can be dangerous because there's, before and after videos, and there's measure your waist with a headphone challenge, right? And like all these things that can be really influential to teens. And so, reminding too that, one of the things that I also remind is that like everyone's using filters these days, right? Like nothing's real. Everyone is putting the highlight reels on social media. We're not seeing what happens before or after that photo is taken. We don't know what happened that morning with that person. So just kind of reminding them of that. And, also again, I know this is an all girls school, but some of you might have boys too. And so, recognizing that this is not just a girl's issue, like this is also a boy's issue. And usually it manifests differently for both. I will say that. And, for those who also identify as non-binary, it's going to manifest different. It's going to look different. But at the end of the day, it does affect all kids, all genders, all teens. And there's different expectations, and there's different kind of standards that kids feel like they have to look up to. And so kind of reminding them there is no such thing as perfection. There's no such thing. And again, that people are using filters, people are showing us only the good, the highlights, and nothing, and not, anything else. Okay. Okay. So COVID-19. So we actually saw more eating disorders than we ever have when COVID hit. And, there's a lot of different reasons for this. I think part of it was that COVID was and is still happening, a very uncontrollable situation. And eating disorders thrive in control. Usually someone feels like they can't control anything, but they can control what they put in their bodies, their food, and they can control their exercise. So I think that it was definitely a way for people to control that. I also think though that, a lot of times kids were going to school and they were able to skip things like breakfast and lunch, and that wasn't really happening anymore because they were at home. And so parents were more mindful of what was going on under their roofs and recognizing faster when kids weren't eating, or they weren't doing things that, made sense during meal times, or they had a routine, or they were constantly going to the bathroom after they were eating. So I definitely too think that, parents were noticing things more quickly. But also we were seeing a higher rate of severity and acuity. And I think that's because eating disorders thrive in isolation, and COVID-19 isolated all of us. So I think that, these eating disorders were thriving in that environment. Adolescents had more time to kind of obsess over the way they looked. They had more time on devices. They had more time on social media. So they were really able to do deep dives into, people who probably might have not been the best influences on social media. So definitely, we definitely saw an increase in eating disorders during COVID, and still are seeing them. There's like not enough providers in the country right now for eating disorders. I mean, in terms of like the treatment world too, there's just wait list upon wait lists for people to get into treatment. So it's really sad, actually right now, which brings me to like, what do I do if my child is struggling? First off, I always say this, trust your parental intuition. If you think something is wrong, it probably is, right? Like you do know your children best. If you feel like there has been a change in their food, in their exercise, in the way that they think about themselves, take note of that. I kind of always say like, there's no such thing as overreacting when it comes to eating disorders. I think that, there certainly is a harm in underreacting, but there's not a harm in reacting to a change that you see in your child associated with food or their body, because typically, if it's not addressed, it's going to get worse. And getting them help as soon as you see it, or as soon as possible, could be the best thing that you do for them. Tell them that you're worried and try to explain changes you've noticed. So really noticing, so with this though, noting that you're talking about the behavior and not their body. So saying things of like, I've noticed that you're skipping meals and this worries me because, instead of saying something like, I noticed that you've lost a lot of weight. Because even if the intention of that is to say that you're concerned, the eating disorder, if the eating disorder is thriving on losing weight and restriction, the eating disorder hears, oh, I'm losing weight. I'm doing a really good job. I'm going to keep doing that. So just really focusing on the behavior and not anything to do with the body. Call professionals who specialize in eating disorders. There are many of them. And it's really important that they specialize in eating disorders. So I would 100% ask them, like if they have specialty on their page, their Psychology Today page, or whatever page that says eating disorders, ask them what their experience in eating disorders is, because reading a book about eating disorders is not experience in eating disorders. So really, really asking them, like, do you see people who struggle with eating disorders? Have you worked in an environment with eating disorders? Like, what does your experience really look like? And honestly, that really goes for like anything, whenever you are looking into a therapist, or, you're looking for someone to specialize in something for your child, just asking them like, what is their experience with that? And then again, try not to make any comments, positive and negative, about their body or body changes. And kind of like I said before, your intent can be amazing and your impact not as much, especially when it comes to eating disorders. Eating disorder voices are very loud. We talk about it in terms of healthy self and eating disorder self. And sometimes eating disorder self can just be extremely loud and overtake healthy self. And whenever the eating disorder hears something about a body or their body, really takes it and runs with it. Treatment for eating disorders. So more oftentimes than not, eating disorders will need a higher level of care. So not just a therapist once a week, but more of like an intensive outpatient program or a day treatment program or a program that really specializes in eating disorders. And they can be really helpful. And some of the therapeutic techniques with eating disorders include CBT, motivational interviewing, individual and group therapy. Group therapy can be really helpful with eating disorders in having a common struggle. And then narrative therapy. So that's what I was talking about when I said eating disorder self and healthy self, and just kind of rewriting the narrative for themselves. And then here are some resources. So I know this will also be recorded. So if you want to take a picture of this slide, or you can, probably watch it again, but NEDA is a really good website. Sick Enough, A Guide to the Medical Complications of Eating Disorders, is a really good book that I highly recommend to parents, especially if your child is struggling or has ever struggled before. Life Without Ed is a really good initial read into eating disorders and kind of better understanding what an eating disorder is and what it's like to live with one. And then Nicole Cruz, who I mentioned before, is really great in following and just really getting the language piece when talking to your kids about food. Oh, one sec. My computer is like lagging. I'm so sorry. Okay. So last, if you don't remember anything about my talk, anything, but this, comes up in your house, just remember these two things. One is never comment on your child's body, your body, or anyone other's body around you. Just showing your kids and showing your children that, the least interesting thing about them is their body. And there's so many things that are so much more interesting about them. And so many things that people are going to value in them that have nothing to do with the way that they look or their body. And two is not moralizing food. So trying to get away from good, bad, clean, junk, healthy, unhealthy, and really trying to look at food as just that, food. Because that's something that can get ingrained in a child very early on. And there is my contact information. Again, my name is Jessie Carmen. My email is edconsultjmc@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram as edconsultjmc, and my website is www.carmencc.org. Feel free to reach out to me if you ever have a question or need a consult on something or whatever it may be. But with that, I would love to open it up to questions, comments, whatever it may be. Can write them in the chat, or you can say them, whatever works for you.
I have a question.
Oh, and also, sorry, because I did just get a direct message. Please feel free to just message them to me too, and I can read them aloud if you want me to. So why don't
I have a question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Question about, my daughter's 12 and a half. So
Yeah.
her body's changing and all the things.
Yeah.
And, I don't see a lot of the signs that you're talking about, but I do know that she's having a hard time seeing her string bean body turn into more of what a normal, not normal, whatever, a healthy woman's body.
Yes.
And there are some tears, there are some, and her being like, I'm getting so big, and just, the conversation around like, this is turning into a woman and this, just that time.
Yeah. No, yeah. I think like normalizing it is the most important part, right? Like the fact that like, this is so normal. This is so typical. This is something that everyone goes through. This is something I went through, right? Like, and you might already be doing these things, but it's like normalizing it and also making it a point to recognize that like, it actually wouldn't be normal for your body to stay how it is when you were 11 years old, right? That's not normal. This is normal. This is typical. And we would actually be more concerned if your body wasn't changing. I think that's sometimes a good way to approach it, because again, like you're right. Like, I'm a 7th grade teacher. I see this all the time. Like, girls, really struggling with these body changes, and like, they happen really quickly. They happen like overnight sometimes. Right. And like, that's really hard. That's really hard. So I also think normalizing and validating the experience that like, yeah, this is tough. This is hard. This is tough. It's uncomfortable. And like, it kind of sucks.
Yeah.
It's so normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what we've been kind of saying and stuff, but it's a hard, thing because
oh, for sure. And
she wants to stay string beanie,
I know. It's so hard. It's so hard. Yeah. So I just think like continuing to normalize that experience. So important.
Awesome.
I also think it's really great that she's talking to you about it, that she's not having these feelings inside of her head in isolation where they can blossom and where they can, and I would also suggest maybe that if she's using social media already, maybe you sit with her. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yay.
I know she's not. So we've at least have that going for us for a while, but yeah.
Good.
Yes. I have a question here. How do you help your child navigate eating in front of friends who embrace a culture of positively reinforcing restrictive eating? What should you say to your child, and what should they say to their friends who they adore but are being negatively affected by this behavior, beginning to restrict themselves to fit in? Oh, that's tough. That's so tough, and something that we see all the time. I think that first off, I think it's, really great if your daughter is talking to you about this, or your child is talking to you about this and kind of saying like, this is a situation that I've been in with my friends, or this is an uncomfortable situation that I've been in with my friends. And, I think that also reinforcing the fact that like, that must be really hard to watch your friends do that and like be in a place where people are restricting, reminding her or, them or your child that, restricting is harmful and it can be dangerous. And like, we want to fuel our bodies. Like we want to fuel our bodies. And like, you hope that the friends that, she has that are restricting, like that their parents know about it too. I mean, I think that if it's at a point where you're feeling like, oh, this is really affecting my child and like, it's very unhealthy for the other kids. Like I know that it can be really tough to kind of like talk to other parents about this, But I do think sometimes it warrants a conversation of like, hey, like I've been noticing that, you know, your daughter or your child is doing X, Y, and Z, and I'm concerned about it. Kind of what I was saying in the slides before. Again, being mindful from what I said in the presentation that like every single person has a relationship with food in their body. So like these conversations can feel uncomfortable. And, you know, people are coming in with their own stuff, like even kids' parents are coming in with their own relationships or food in their body. But I wouldn't completely disregard the fact of like looping the parents into, especially if it's starting to affect your child and like they're starting to restrict too. And like also just like, you know, reminding them to like be their own person and, you know, can, you know, be themselves, like be themselves and, you know, not needing to restrict to fit in. There's some really good books too for things like this of, you know, talking about just this, like, you know, being around diet culture and feeling like you have to do something to fit in. And so I would also recommend getting some body positivity books or just reading and you reading it yourself and also having, you know, your child read it too, if it's appropriate. And then, yeah.
And I just want to add that, you know, if it's happening at school, I really want to, I encourage you to let me or Morgan Duggan, if your child is in middle school, know so that we can, you know, address this, work with them. Obviously, we are working so hard to counteract all of this kind of stuff. I also think that it's really helpful if you're, again, when your child comes to talk to you about this, to sort of help them frame it in the way that Jessie did earlier, which is that these are coping mechanisms, right? These are not about the food, but it's about the coping mechanism. So talk with your children about what are other coping mechanisms that I use, that you could use, you know, again, so helping your own child sort of build a repertoire of coping mechanisms that don't have the risk of becoming dangerous for them. Is, I think, a really important part of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely hear you about staying away from any talk about bodies. Would love your advice on how to respond to I'm so fat, I'm so short, etc. Such a good question. I get this question all the time. Yeah. So you know, reminding in your mind, knowing that fat and short are not a feeling, right? So I'm so fat, I'm so short, I feel so fat, I feel so whatever, not feelings. And so usually there's something else going on with that, right? So if your child is constantly saying, I feel so fat, I'm so fat, I'm so fat, there's typically something going on. And so I would recommend kind of getting more to the bottom of that, right? And so, you know, not engaging in the I'm so fat conversation. It can be really compelling to be like, no, you're not. Oh my God, you're not at all. You're not at all. No, you're not. Oh my gosh. Cause again, like intent versus impact, it kind of reinforces the fact that, you know, it reinforces fat phobic culture, which is like something I could do a whole other talk on, but also, it reinforces that like they think that's a bad thing and that would be a bad thing, right? And so saying something like what's going on, or like how are you feeling, like kind of trying to divert the conversation into more of a like what's really going on here versus like I'm so fat, because usually it's not about that. That would be my biggest advice on that. What do you think the role of an all-girls school is in creating a healthy and supportive environment for the girls when it comes to food? I know that sugary foods are frequently used to attract girls to club meetings, affinity groups, counselor's office. I realize that a lot of those interactions takes place during breaks and the girls may be hungry. I would love to see the culture change that so more nutritionally dense foods are available rather than donuts and candy. I have also heard from my girls that they go into the bathroom and pretty regularly hear girls throwing up often after these meetings. Okay, so I think first of all, like definitely contacting the school, counselors in that regard, especially with the girls throwing up, because that's very concerning. Two, I would kind of say, I would personally probably say not to get rid of the, maybe nutritionally, not nutritionally dense foods, but maybe just add other food selections as well. Right. And so like, there's more of a variety where girls can choose what they want to eat, or, what they're feeling like having on that day. Again, it gives more of a variety, but not the all or nothing technique. So like not having all nutritionally dense foods or all nutritionally, non-dense foods, but rather just having more of an eclectic mix. And then again, just wanted to reiterate, like if people are hearing girls throw up in the bathroom, like definitely contact like a trusted adult at school, notifying them that like this is happening so that the school can monitor that more closely. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I mean, that's exactly it. Yes, we have, we've heard reports of the bathrooms. We've been increasing, supervision, and we've had a lot of conversations about the secret snacks and about just providing options that are more nutrient dense alongside the things that are less nutrient dense. I'm not going to lie, like this fall is really very different for the kids in terms of their emotional well-being than any other year that I've ever been in my 25 years of working in schools. So, this is really, we need all hands on deck to be taking care of the well-being of our kids right now. So, and we need to partner together. We all need to be rowing in the same direction. So definitely Morgan and I want to hear anything specific, and you can certainly, call us with concerns, and it will stay private and confidential within us. But we're certainly aware that this stuff is happening, and we're working very hard to address it.
Mm-hmm. Circling back to the last question, it seems like there is peer pressure or self-pressure to fit in, and that eating disorders can become contagious among groups. That's actually really true. Yeah, eating disorders can become contagious around groups. And not only can they become contagious, but they can also become competitive. So it can be, it's rough. It's really rough. And so I think that's why it's even more important that, people are bringing these concerns to the school, and also, that they're having talks like this, right? Because like you were saying, Marissa, like it's important to have the conversations that are happening at school also happening at home. So like everyone's on the same page. And so again, kind of bringing up the idea that like eating disorders are a coping mechanism, right? And so usually if someone in a group of friends has developed an eating disorder and is now coping, pseudo coping better with their stress and anxiety, the friend's like, oh, that sounds good, I'm going to do that too, right? And then you're right, it becomes contagious. So again, really talking about coping mechanisms and framing that in a positive way of like, what can we do to eliminate stress and, feel better that doesn't involve doing maladaptive eating disorder or coping behavior. So yeah. Last thing, I think that the amount of pressure that the girls experience at school also exacerbates this, and they use it as a coping medicine. The school has repeatedly talked about controlling the amount of time that the girls have to spend on homework every night, but I have not seen the techniques lead to any stress reduction. I obviously can't speak on behalf of the school, but I will say as a teacher in a school, in an independent school, that I have never seen kids so stressed in my entire life. Like kids are so stressed. My 12 and 13-year-olds have back problems. Like it makes me so sad because they're so stressed. And I think that this post-pandemic / in pandemic world is making kids just so incredibly stressed, which, makes us as educators and, everyone needing to, really think about, how do we reduce the stress for kids at this time, and how do we introduce positive coping mechanisms to their lives. So I completely hear and validate what you're saying, because kids are so stressed these days at alarmingly high rates. And I also think that the transition, and again, can't speak on behalf of your school, but I will say that the transition from Zoom teaching to school learning has been a big one, and one that is just different, I think, for everyone. And, I saw something on, social media or somewhere where it was saying that, 7th graders, for instance, are actually like 5th graders, because the last time they had school in person for real, they were in 5th grade. And so it's kind of like taking 2.5 years off your kids' lives, but they're expected to be in the actual grade that they are. And socio-emotionally, they just aren't there. And so it's so difficult for them to participate and like be fully present in the grade that they are, when really they're 2.5 years behind. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Marissa, but that's what I've been seeing, at least.
I think we've absolutely been seeing that. And we've been talking about it as a faculty, as a whole school constantly. I'm constantly reminding people, yeah, the last time this person had a 5-day work week, essentially at school, was a year and a half ago. And so they've missed a year and a half of really also important developmental time, right? Because so much of what going to school serves for kids is they don't have their parent or guardian in the next room. So they learn to self-soothe a little bit. They learn to tolerate being scared, being anxious, being frustrated without that comfort person right there. And now, boom, they're right back,
For
So
sure.
one of the things that we've been doing, obviously, is really, again, I'm reminding teachers constantly, like, she might be in 10th grade, but she's probably got some 8th grade skills happening. So let's adjust our expectations, not lowering the rigor of the education, not lowering the quality of the education, but just trying to meet the kids where they are more developmentally, because they have missed a year and a half of really important developmental time, which if a kid is 12 years old or 13 or 14 years old, that's a significant portion of their life that they have had. I jokingly sort of say, like, our country has unfortunately been forced to engage in a sort of uncontrolled research study on all these kids. We had to do it to keep them alive, but we don't really know what the long-term effects are going to be. Right now, what I'm experiencing, and all of my peers at every school, even back in Philly, is the same thing, just what Jessie said. These kids are not, they're very dysregulated. And we're dysregulated. The adults are dysregulated. The parents are dysregulated. We're also not used to having our kids being out in the world without us. So when we get a phone call or a text, or our child comes home upset and sad, we also get very reactive. So there's just a lot of emotional reactivity. And, I think really what we need to do is keep being open to our kids, keep allowing them, making sure that they know it's safe to talk to us about anything. We're not going to judge them. We're also going to keep our emotions in check when they come to us, and be calm and neutral and loving and supportive when they're with us. And then as soon as they're out of the room, we call our friend and cry, or we call our support person, or you call me or Morgan at school and say, I don't know what to do. Right. But with our kid, we really just have to, just be very, very loving, neutral, supportive, and encourage them to externalize in healthy ways, what they're experiencing. Because none of us, we're all new at this. This is a whole new experience for everybody. But they're kids, they're learning.
With a couple more questions that I can answer. So with respect to ARFID eating disorder, what therapy is there? How do you help a child who finds a lot of food to be repulsive and doesn't want to try new food? Great question. There is exposure therapy is huge with ARFID, and hierarchy work. So this is actually something that I wanted to note, is that if you think a child might have ARFID, really asking the therapist if they ever have experience in ARFID as well, because just if a therapist has experience in eating disorders, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have experience in hierarchy work when it comes to ARFID. Basically, with ARFID, you need someone who's going to be able to make a hierarchy with your kid in noting what are the scariest foods and what are the least scariest foods, and we're going to tackle them together. So exposure, and then also occupational therapy is something that sometimes people with ARFID need. There's sometimes rumination disorder, which is like when food kind of comes back up when people are trying to eat it. And so occupational therapy can help a lot with ARFID as well. So exposure therapy and occupational therapy are the two kind of cornerstones for ARFID. Do the Marlboro students have talks like this on campus to help educate them on this issue, as well as give them a place to talk about the challenges they face in this area? Do you want to touch upon that?
Sure. Yes. Thank you. In health and wellness classes, they learn all about, this, and we as a school have adopted a very intentional body neutrality position. It's not body positivity because, frankly, I don't know a woman who loves her body. And I think that's really hard as an aspirational goal to say, I'm going to love my body, right? None of us do. So instead, we really focus on a body neutrality, which is, as Jessie was saying, what can my body do? I appreciate what my body can do for me. And less hyper focus on how it looks and meeting any standards. So we are fully involved in that. We have worked with our food provider, Sage, to eliminate some things that I think were well-intentioned, but were landing, inappropriately with the students, and we didn't like them. So we're working with them. There's a really good amount now of nutrient-dense foods that are sort of available for kids all day long, free at school, which I think really helps. Nice. We have in our advisory program, students have the same advisor for 3 years so that they are hopefully building a relationship that feels good. This year, we also will be bringing in Jessie to speak with the students themselves in probably not the whole school. The issue is this kind of stuff has to happen consistently, this consistent messaging, and also can't be like in an assembly, right? Like an all school assembly is not the place to talk about these things. So, Morgan and I obviously have experience and especially Morgan, expertise in this area, but we're going to bring Jessie in. As you can see, she's really great. And I think the kids will really relate to her. So we are working on it. It's top of the list.
2 more questions. So one is, how does LGBTQ play into eating disorders? There's definitely multiple ways. It does definitely go back to the control a little bit too. I think that when people are going through the coming out experience, sometimes they can feel a lack of control in wanting to, control certain things and et cetera. And so that can certainly play a role. And then what I was saying before too, where we see this a lot in trans youth, is that, someone who, identifies as transgender, is feeling really uncomfortable in their body. And so, they're trying to, and one of the ways that they might want to feel more comfortable, right, is manipulating their body. And so if, someone is growing breasts, let's say, and like that's a very uncomfortable experience for them, they might feel like restriction or making their body or trying to make their body smaller is going to make them feel more comfortable. And so sometimes we see that happening a lot as well. So certainly a correlation, and certainly something that those who are in the LGBTQ plus community have a higher rate of eating disorders. And then the last question, what would your advice be for a kid who is not exhibiting any of the behaviors mentioned, but definitely spends way too much time and brain space emitted by her thinking and worrying about body? I think one of the things that I would urge you to like observe a little bit more is if they actually aren't exhibiting any of the behaviors, because they might be, like, just maybe not in front of you. And so maybe inquiring a little bit more about that, because if there is such a high brain space being occupied by food and their body and their weight, it's more likely than not that they are having some behaviors. They just might not be as like explicit or as exhibited like by you, or maybe they're doing them like, maybe it's happening at school, or maybe it's like happening in their room, right? Like sometimes we'll hear of like people doing like exercise routines in their room, which is like usually not like a normalized way to exercise, like doing like abs in like your bed or your floor. Like that's not as normalized in terms of exercise. So monitoring that a little bit more, I would say. And I would encourage therapy too. Like I would say like, wow, like it seems like a lot of your brain space is being occupied by food and weight. And that seems really exhausting and really tiring. And I would love, would you want to talk to someone about that? Because it is exhausting. I mean, to be thinking about anything, right, for so long, for most of the day, or, 75% of your brain, that's a lot. And it's really tiring. And so I would definitely encourage them to talk to someone.
I would just also add that, as Jesse said, one of the real reasons why I think, or one of the main reasons why I think we're seeing so many more eating disorders right now is this sense of control. Again, Jesse mentioned this earlier. The world feels very uncertain, very out of control right now. So even maybe talking about your child and thinking of places, when a child comes to see me, a kid comes to see me in the office, I'm always trying to think of how can I encourage their autonomy? How can I encourage them to have a sense of agency in their own life? When we think about it, the American school system, kids don't have a lot of control over their own time, over their own, what they're going to do next, their schedules, things like that. And, add then COVID on top of it, and add, political unrest and, all sorts of stuff that's happening in the country, it can feel very insecure and very out of control. So, one of the things, yes, talk to your kids, help them about it, but also think about explicitly and intentional ways that you can help your child feel a sense of control over how they're spending their time, decisions that they're making. So that, again, they can get that sense of, okay, right, yes, I am growing up. Yes, I am competent. Yes, I can be out in the world. I am safe, right? Part of this is we've been under almost 2 years of feeling completely unsafe all the time, right? Like that is physiologically on the nervous system extremely taxing. So, these are kids that are just grasping at straws to get a sense of safety back. Control makes us feel safe. When we feel that we have control, it makes us feel, often falsely, but that it makes us feel safe. So I would look for ways to encourage your kids' opportunities and feelings around agency and autonomy. Yeah.
I think that's all. I think that's all the questions, but if you ever have any other questions and you want to shoot me an email, please feel free to. And it was so amazing seeing you all on Zoom and talking to you. And I'm so glad that we were able to do this. So thank you so much for coming.
Jesse, will you share with me some of the book recommendations that you have?
Oh, absolutely.
And then I'll make sure to put that up on my Marlboro somewhere for you all to have access to that.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, so much. And I hope everybody has a great night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jesse.
Bye.
Bye.